Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. Having lurked in the shadows for decades, far-right parties in Europe are now seeing electoral victories, with their big wins coming from the EU Parliament elections in June. And that growing trend was also seen in Germany's state elections earlier this month. The nation's anti-immigration Alternative for Germany party received a record number of votes in the east, which has some communities there worried. One group is the Turkish community, whose roots date back to the 1960s, when thousands migrated to fill jobs in West Germany's post-war booming economy. Now reports are showing rising fears among Germans with Turkish roots and other immigrant groups that these far-right political gains will translate into policy. And with federal elections only a year away and the AfD running second in opinion polls, Turks and other immigrant groups fear the far-right could take the majority in the parliament. Far-right groups have often blamed migrants for rising housing costs, inflation, and other economic difficulties. And for more on the far-right's win in Germany, political analyst Javier Faje is joining me now from London, and from Brussels, Başak Yavcan, the head of research at the Migration Policy Group. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Javier, Germany's far-right AfD won its first state election since 1945. How significant is this?
It's extremely significant because if this trend is reflected in the federal elections next year, then they could have a foothold on power at a federal level. It is significant because, as you said, it's the first time since the Second World War that a far-right party has gained so much power in many ways. They won in Thuringia and they came second in Saxony. Now, on the other hand, Germany, since the Second World War, has been a country of coalitions. Governments have been coalitions. So whether this party will be part of a coalition in either of those states remains to be seen. But it is extremely significant because this is happening in Eastern Germany. Germany, after reunification in 1991, East Germans, who used to be part of the communist Germany, were expecting what somebody called, quote unquote, a nanny state, but even richer. They haven't got that. There's been a lot of neglect, according to them, and they have pushed them. They've been pushed towards a radical far by people who come from actually the West. So extremely significant. It would be even worse if this trend remains for the elections in September next year for the federal parliament.
So, Başak, Javier just mentioned far right is strong in the country's east, but weak in the west. What are the socioeconomic differences between these two regions?
Socioeconomic differences are definitely important in that unemployment rates in the eastern part is definitely higher, and they may feel more pressure and more threatened by the existence of migrants or future arrival of migrants, most of which would be also competing with them in low-skilled jobs. But it's also important to mention the historical turn on this, because East and West Germany were separated for a very long time. And while West Germany has confronted its past with Nazi Germany and did everything it can to offset this, to prevent this from happening again, there was no such turn in the Eastern Germany. So there was no such socialization. As a result, for instance, it is much more accepted to express more discriminative feelings in Eastern Germany as compared to the West, and there was no actual acknowledgement of what could be the ramifications of a very exclusivist attitude. How does it become racism, and how this can lead to very disastrous results for Germany, as it did in the past. So I believe that also has an impact on the lack of that kind of socialization, political and historical socialization, also contributes to the success of far right in Eastern Germany, former Eastern Germany.
Okay, so Javier, what do the AfD and like-minded parties offer to their voters? I mean, are their promises viable amid ongoing international conflicts?
The key element in these parties is immigration. That has been almost one issue parties in many ways. Of course, they go beyond that, like AfD, for example, is against more support for Ukraine, for example. They are pro-Russian. But the key issue is immigration. That's how they have emphasized the campaign. They believe that the government of Schulz has not done enough to stop immigration, what they call illegal immigration, and what is called irregular immigration. So they have been using that as a big weapon in order to get votes from areas which feel threatened. Now, our colleague in Brussels mentioned the neglectful element of Eastern Germany. Well, people in poor areas, whether it's Germany or other parts of Europe, tend to blame immigrants for these kind of things, unfairly, obviously. So they've been emphasizing their campaign on the issue of immigration, and they have highlighted in many ways what they consider the failure of the federal government in fighting what they call illegal immigration. Of course, we remember some years ago, then Angela Merkel allowed many refugees to come into the country. They've taken advantage of that. But also they want to link immigration with terrorism. You remember that earlier this year there was a terrorist attack by a Syrian refugee, and some people died, and they took advantage of that. Of course, they tried to blame all immigrants, and they tried to use the word terrorism to all immigrants, which is part of the rhetoric they use. So they've been using that in different shades to be able to convince people that they are the only alternative which is going to prevent more immigration from coming into Germany.
But Javier, what kind of political ramifications has the country seen so far?
Well, first of all, that has shaken the political system in Germany. The biggest loser in this particular case was the SDP, which is the Social Democratic Party. They were the biggest losers in both Thuringia and Saxony. The CDU managed to sort of maintain a bit of support, but that's a big support, which is the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. That's the ramification. Second, as I said before, the governments in Germany after the Second World War have been coalitions, sort of like agreements between political parties of different tendencies to prevent, the far right coming into power, as it happened in the 1930s.
Yes.
But whether the AfD will be part of a coalition with the CEU, for example, that remains to be seen. But the ramification is serious, because if this trend becomes trend for the federal elections in September next year, then we could have a problem in Germany, which could spread in the rest of Europe anyway.
So, Javier, are there any similarities between Germany and France when it comes to more isolationism and xenophobic policies?
Oh, yes. Until some years ago, far-right parties in Europe were reluctant to show their faces openly in the international arena. But in the past 5 to 6 years, they've been really shameless in terms of saying, look, here we are, because they've been getting more and more support. Many of them are very critical of the way the European Union deals with immigration, but also with the economy, especially after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which affected many countries in Europe and pushed many people from the poor side of societies towards the far right. So they are trying to take advantage of that. They are not exactly anti-EU, but they criticize the way the EU has managed, they consider has managed the situation in Europe. The ramification would be that now they can openly show the faces and show the bigoted nature of their policies. That is the big difference between now and, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they would be more shy. They would not be so open in terms of now they do it. They get together, they have meetings, they have conferences openly, and they don't have any problem in doing that, because they know that they are gaining support in a very disappointed European countries, which believe that the Brussels has not, but they believe it anyway, whether you agree with that or not, that's a different matter, believe that the European Union is not managing the situation well, economically, socially, and in terms of immigration.
So, Başak, the German chancellor has called on all political parties to isolate the far right. How practical is this under current circumstances?
Historically, this has been very practical and very useful. It's called the cordon sanitaire, and we see this in many countries across Europe. The winning parties try to isolate the FarRight parties because they see them really too extreme for the liberal political atmosphere. However, that becomes very difficult as the party wins higher votes, because then it becomes a reality that so many parties that have nothing to do with each other ideologically or economically, their life, the view of life, will have to come together to do this, which makes it very difficult, and then probably a dysfunctional coalition. And that would only help the hand of far right in the following elections. So there may already in some states in Germany and also France, we see that slowly being abandoned, and some more engagement with far right
Yes.
bargaining, and we would expect more of this to come about. So even one thing we should also consider is they don't have to be in the government to have an impact on policy. Already there's a lot of research that shows that the discourse and the policies of the center right and even centrist policies are shifting to the right as the far right is gaining so much momentum, especially on the migration ground.
So, Javier, one
Yes.
last question. How would far-right parties' potential dominance on German politics affect its relations with Muslim minorities as well as several Muslim nations?
I think one of the advantages that in this particular case, the immigrant communities, especially the Turkish communities, is that they have a foothold in German economy. They helped rebuild German economy after the Second World War, and the Turkish community has a good role to play. In Cologne, for example, earlier this year, there were demonstrations against the far right in Cologne, which has the second biggest Turkish population community in Germany. Now, the Chancellor Scholz praised that demonstration. That means that they have an element of strength in terms of the economic role that the Turkish community plays in Germany, especially after the Second World War, especially in the last 20 years, I would say, but also in terms of the need that the government, the federal government has to have the Turkish community and the immigrant community on their side. Don't forget that the far right is trying to woo some parts of the immigration, of the immigrants to vote for them. That's very dangerous. But the Turkish community has a great deal of influence in parts of Germany, like Berlin, like Cologne, etc. And that could be an advantage for them. And that could be the element that the government needs to be able to put a stop to the emergence or the growth of the far right in Germany.
All right, Javier and Başak, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.